welcome to Daily Debrief, your primer on international news brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Swastika, and in this episode, we'll be discussing Tuesday's summit between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin, a controversial new law in Australia, and the refugee crisis in Europe. Now, we begin with the virtual summit planned between US President Joe Biden and the Russian President Vladimir Putin on Tuesday. The summit takes place at a time when tensions are mounting, especially on the issue of Ukraine, which we talked about on the show recently, and a number of other issues, including Afghanistan and Libya. My colleague Prashanth spoke to NewsClick's editor-in-chief Prabir Purkayastha on the meeting and its expected outcomes. Take a look.
Prabir, thank you so much for joining us. So, another important meeting between Putin and Biden scheduled for Tuesday comes as a follow-up, of course, to the Geneva meeting in June, which had very mixed results. But this meeting also taking place at a time when, tensions have risen. We've talked about this before on the border. The entire Western media going about hundreds and thousands of Russian soldiers mobilizing on the borders, for instance. So what do you think is likely to be the position of both these countries tomorrow in the meeting? And are we likely to see any kind of breakthrough, for instance, or any kind of lowering of the tensions?
I don't think you will see an immediate change in the scenario, because for that to happen, there has to be a lot more backroom negotiations, discussions, which we haven't seen. So what we have seen is really brinkmanship. And essentially, it boils down to NATO moving to Russia's borders. And that Putin has said, according to him, that's a red line. They will not accept essentially missile batteries armed with nuclear weapons on their borders in Ukraine. This, of course, is one part of the issue. The second part of the issue is simply also in the Minsk agreement, Donbas region had been promised autonomy. And that autonomy, discussions, self-governing spaces, all that was to happen after that. That has not happened. And it doesn't look like that any of the NATO powers, in this case, France and Germany, and of course the United States behind them, is interested in the Minsk Accord actually being implemented. So they want to essentially Ukraine to take over the Donbas region. And if that happens, that's a military action then the Ukrainian government would have to do. If that happens, Russian-speaking people, Russian ethnicity, all of that means that it is unlikely that Russia will let that happen without intervening in it. And then, of course, you are faced with the situation of a war. And Russia's borders, where Russia has militarily much more strength than Ukraine has. In spite of all the talk about Ukraine being much better equipped and positioned, etc., the fact is the Ukrainian army has bled over the period, and it has also been taken over partly by what would be called the ex-Nazi or the Nazi identity-based politics, which seems to also gain ground in Ukraine. So given that, I do not believe that this militarily is going to be a contest unless NATO wants to intervene militarily in that. So I think that situation is not going to change. This tension scenario is not going to change. What may happen is the chance of an immediate military flare-up may not be there. Now, the United States has been portraying, or the Western media has been portraying, as Russian aggression, mobilizing, and so on and so forth. But the other part of it, which they're not saying, is the fact that the Ukrainian forces are also talking about entering Donbas region and seizing it back, putting it under its control. So both these are also then possibilities. And if both these are to be averted, at the moment, if Biden-Putin talks ensure that, at least then we have a temporary reprieve. The larger problem, this reprieve may be temporary, but the larger problem still remains. Does NATO come up to Russia's borders? And recently, as we keep on talking in our discussions, the Freedom of Information Act has also shown, the NSA, National Security Archives, has put out all the documents which are a part of the 90s. What are the assurances that the United States had given Russia, specifically with respect to the eastward march of NATO? And as one of the articles really headlines that very well, is I think it's in the Responsible Statecraft, which says that how much the US and the Western powers have deviated from the promises made can actually be measured. They had said 1 inch. The NATO will not travel 1 inch from German borders. They have traveled 600 miles. So that's a measurable quantity. So that's how much the US and the Western powers have deviated from their promises. And I think that's still the underlying issue. But I don't expect that to be settled here. I do not expect that the Americans are going to reverse the eastward march of NATO. But can they respect the fact that Donbas region will not be militarily integrated again with Ukraine? And then the NATO forces come right up to Russia's borders on the Ukrainian side as well. If that can be averted for the time being, then I think we have some hopes. I'm hoping that at least Biden and Putin will put the Donbass and the possibility of a conflict over Donbass at least in the cold storage for the time being. If they do that, if the status quo, I think then we are not likely to see a flare up. But the status quo is actually at the moment threatened more by Ukrainian action under the protection and probably the instigation of some of the NATO powers who would like this brinkmanship. And I don't know why. So I think that is the crux of the issue. So let's hope that at least a temporary cooling down takes place and it doesn't lead to what is threatening to be a possible military action on both sides. And if that happens, then both sides are nuclear armed forces, NATO as well as Russia, and that is a horrendous threat to the world.
Right. Thank you so much, Prabir. We'll be following this issue and we'll get back to you on this as well.
Our next story is from Australia, where the government is pushing a bill that seeks to enshrine freedom of expression for religious people and organizations. But this bill has been widely condemned, especially by the LGBTQ organizations, which say it will provide a cover for bigotry and prejudice. Protests were also held against the proposed law, which is called the Religious Discrimination Bill. Anish, who's here with us in the studio. Welcome, Anish. If you could tell us what makes this bill controversial.
Well, the provisions itself speak for itself, actually. So, if you look at some of the provisions, like it begins with the fact that it says that nobody can be discriminated against for their religious beliefs, and this includes even in the services that they offer. Now, the issue is that with this very provision, you can actually interpret it in many ways. But it adds to that in later parts of the bill where it says that the religious organizations or religious institutions run by religious organizations like Catholic schools and so on, they can prefer or give preference to people or candidates from their religious denomination or their religious beliefs or who subscribe to those doctrines. And they can also decide how this, how they subscribe to the doctrines and how it is to be, what kind of preference is to be given. And they all say that if it is done in good faith, then it's all right. Now, the issue with this is that one of the first issues that came up is the question of how big is religious discrimination in Australia, especially considering this government has done very little when it comes to actually dealing with, say, Islamophobic statements from not only members of the parliament, but also members like political figures and social organizations. So, or for that matter, hate crimes that have been on the rise, and the kind of religious minorities that have always been at the receiving end of this are not really very keen on how this bill is going to affect them. On top of that, this also gives cover to Christian organizations to discriminate, if they want to, people based on their sexuality and their gender or their sexual identity. And this makes it the most contentious part of the bill because this is something that has been illegal in Australia for a very long time, like decades. Australia was one of the first countries that actually brought up a discrimination bill, that anti-discrimination bill that actually covered sexual minorities and people who identified with the gender that they were assigned, different from what they were assigned on their birth. So these issues are going to be a huge problem. And that itself shows how the government is trying to gear towards a certain conservative religious group and vote base, considering the fact that elections are just months away. Actually, it's not that far off. So it is going to be next year, and so they are pretty much gearing up for that.
Anish, actually it does bring us to the next question. What is the response of various political parties or the political class?
Yeah, so obviously the ruling party is in favor of it. They are pushing for it. Actually, they have been trying to push through the bill in the last session, but that expired. That did not work around, primarily because the opposition parties, especially the Labour and the Greens, demanded an inquiry on the bill. And there are now 2 inquiries, both in both the houses of the Parliament. And apart from that, there are also issues within the voting bloc with certain more liberal variety of conservatives raising issues about what kind of protections are available for people who come from the sexual minorities, LGBTQ people, and what kind of protections it will, like if the bill will support any kind of discrimination on the basis of your gender or sexual identity. And more importantly, the social organizations have actually come out very much against the bill right now. As we can see, there was a protest last day on Sunday actually, and in Victoria, and not to mention Victoria as a state, like state governments are also pushing against it now. 3 states have already done it, and another state, Victoria, actually joined in passing a law that will pretty much override, or at least override the more homophobic and transphobic possibilities that this federal bill can offer. So they are adding more protections to sexual minorities, not in a way that will affect religious freedoms. There are also questions about what kind of religious freedoms the Morrison government really wants to protect, because this is, as I said before, like there have been questions about his record when it comes to Islamophobic statements or even racism in Australia, and not just people who are Muslims or other religious minorities, but also indigenous faiths that are also currently are at risk or are being infringed upon by not just corporates but various state actors when it comes to mining projects and stuff like that, especially on indigenous lands. So these questions definitely come about. The conservatives are definitely pushing for the religious conservative, Christian conservative groups to support them. The church is currently even pushing against any kind of pushback against the bill right now. They are trying to prevent any kind of compromise, especially when it comes to protecting sexual minorities. And that shows,
it's alarming.
Yeah, it is an alarming situation right now. But at this point, the reaction isn't that huge. But in the coming months, especially since the next session of the parliament is slated to be in February, and the months leading up to that, where there will be a proper inquiry by the parliament, you can actually see more possibilities of not a reaction, but at least a response coming from the conservative and religious groups as well. So that is something that we need to really follow.
We need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Anish. Now let's get on to our next story. We go to Europe again, where Pope Francis visited the island of Lesbos in Greece, which hosts thousands of refugees who have been trying to get to the continent from conflicted hit areas. The Pope had some very harsh things to say about how European countries were dealing with the refugees, at one point appealing to stop this shipwreck of civilization. I talked to Prashanth earlier on this visit and the refugee crisis facing Europe. Welcome to the show, Prashanth. Right on top, The symbolism that this visit carries, considering the refugee crisis, has become quite poignant at this point of time.
Right, Swastika. So, I mean, of course, it's interesting because the Pope had already visited the same island, that's the island of Lesbos, in 2016 when the crisis was at its peak. So, it's also important to note that this visit takes place a year after the most infamous refugee camp on that island, which is the camp of Moria, which was hosting around 12,000 refugees at that point of time. So, its capacity was only to hold 3,000 refugees. It was holding around 12,000, burned down to the ground. Still not very clear why, and that affected the lives of thousands of people. Now, many of these refugees have moved to other places. Right now, in the camp on the island, there are only about 2,200 people. And it's important to note, of course, that the statements the Pope made, which are in line with statements made by sensible and sensitive political leaders, social leaders, activists across the world, who have condemned and decried the countries of the European Union for their failure to handle the problem of refugees, the crisis of refugees, the crisis of migration. And we talked about this multiple times on the show that many of the countries of Europe have a huge role to play in this crisis of refugees, in this mass migration, because of the wars they have launched, because of the economic policies they have pushed on countries to the global south. But nonetheless, when these policies cause migration, when people, the suffering and struggling people of the global south, try to find their way out of these conflict zones, these European countries often impose very, very harsh restrictions. Now there's a lot of talk about building walls, which is another thing the Pope has raised, which many others have also raised. The idea that walls should be built with common funds. By many European countries are now proposing it. Poland recently, during the refugee crisis with Belarus, had taken a very harsh stand, deployed hundreds of and over 1,000 security personnel, I believe, to stop any kind of refugees from entering. But it's not only Poland. Why blame only the right-wing countries? We saw what happened in the English Channel a few weeks ago when refugees drowned while trying to cross that stretch of water. The United Kingdom's policies have been often strongly condemned. Greece itself responsible for a great deal of inhuman treatment of the refugees. The European Union as a whole, for instance, has paid Turkey money. In the past, it has paid Libya money to basically hold refugees in very brutal conditions so that they do not make their way to Europe. So throughout the European Union, what we see is this attempt, this refusal to see refugees and migrants as human beings. It is an attempt to, the only focus has been, let's just keep them somehow out of our shores. Let's not allow them to come to our shores has been the only thought process driving many of these governments. Many of these governments seeing the crisis as a purely law and order problem. Many of these governments seeing the crisis as purely an issue of of criminality, and they conveniently talk about smuggling gangs and all these illegal activities, which are there. Nobody's denying that, but those are not the root causes. And as long as these root causes are not addressed, as long as refugees are not treated as human beings, there is very little hope. So it's a good thing, I think, that the Pope did go to the island of Lesbos, visited the refugees, pointed out, like you said earlier, let's stop this shipwreck of a civilization, which I think is a very poignant statement to make. And he also said that let's not convert our seas to seas of death. All these are very, very important statements that need to be noted. But whether any concrete political action will come out of this is a big question.
Also, Prashanth, if you could tell us a little bit more about the refugee crisis that is brewing in different countries at this point of time, and it's at its peak. If you could tell us a little bit about it.
A lot of people are describing 2015-16 as the peak of the crisis, for instance, in the island in Lesbos, which the Pope visited, because at that point of time, there was the Syrian war crisis, the imperialist Syrian war, the crisis caused by it. I was speaking about 1 million people are believed to have passed through Lesbos itself during that point of time. But if you look at the overall numbers, they show some staggering results. And for example, I'll just read out some numbers. The United Nations Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, which is probably some of the most reliable data, its mid-year numbers say that in 2021, the total number of forcibly displaced people lies at 84 million. Just think of that number. 84 million people are forcibly displaced across the world. And they're displaced due to war, they're displaced due to famine, they're displaced due to climate change, which is a very, very important question that we need to think about, because we have seen extreme weather events caused due to climate change across the world, irrespective of whether countries are rich or poor. But wherever these events happen, there is always a lot of poor people who are often forced to migrate. And the situation is especially worse in countries in Africa, for instance, where droughts or events of that sort cause large-scale migration for even for that matter in Asia. So the global south is actually facing another fresh round of crisis. In addition to the wars imposed by the imperialist powers of the global north, we are also seeing the effects of climate change for again, which some of these European countries are, and the United States often bear the highest responsibility. Even these are causing a huge amount of migration. So you have that single number alone, which is staggering. But even some other numbers, for instance, if you look at 48 million of those people are internally displaced, which means that the chaos and the conflict, some of it, for instance, due to sanctions, like a country like Venezuela, a lot of migration taking place because of the horrific impact of US imposed unilateral sanctions on that country, which so many people across the world have called for the reversal, but it has continued to exist. Or for that matter, let's take, I think the number of refugees alone are 26.6 million people, which is different from for forcibly displaced people, which is a larger category. So we have 26 million refugees alone. Again, this is a mid-year number. The numbers will probably increase by the end of the year. So what we're seeing is a rising trend. The fact that there are some massive ups and downs, but overall the trend has been continuously rising. It seems, at least it seems year after year, because when we did the same report in 2020, that's exactly what we saw as well, that there were again spikes. The coronavirus pandemic, of course, making it much worse because various kinds of restrictions, various kinds of problems with respect to food and say other basic amenities also affecting people. So we see a crisis which clearly is not going to abate anytime soon, because the global governance system, the countries of the world, the governments of the world do not, like I said earlier, they do not have a strategy. They do not have a humane strategy to address the issue. Their only strategy is, let us not for this headache or burden or pain not fall on our shoulders or our heads, is the only strategy that these governments are following. They prefer to think that as long as these refugees can be kept out, as long as these human beings can be kept out, their people and their power will be safe. But the world is not, we do not live in silos. No man lives on an island, as this thing goes. What affects one person in one part of the world will affect everybody. So I think this is a crisis. As time passes, we'll have to have a much more humane perspective on. It remains to be seen, of course, that which are the governments, the political forces which can do that.
Yes, yes. Actually, absolutely right. At this point of time, it is probably going to be which are the countries that are going to step up in terms of their humane policies towards refugees. Well, thank you, Prashanth, for joining us. Well, that's all that we have for you today. Do keep following People's Dispatch and come back to our show, Daily Debrief.